Our next speaker is Dr. Bob Pickering. Bob serves as Professor of Anthropology and Founding Director of the Museum of Science and Management MA program at the University of Tulsa. He also serves as Adjunct Curator of Anthropology at Gilcrease Museum. He co-curated the exhibition Ancient West Mexico, Ritual and Identity with Cheryl Smallwood Roberts, and co-wrote 3 accompanying publications: Shaft Tombs and Figures in West Mexican Society, a Reassessment; Ancient West Mexico, Ritual and Identity; and the Visual Guide to the Occidente Shaft Tomb Ceramic Figures. Please help me welcome Dr. Bob Pickering.
When Holly commented about the amount of time that it takes to create an exhibit, the West Mexico exhibit is a good case. In many ways, that's really the culmination of about 20 to 25 years of my research in West Mexico, starting with the examination of human remains in shaft tombs, and then becoming intrigued by the figures that are sometimes found in those shaft tombs as well. Of course, I think we did it in a rather complicated way here at the museum by putting an exhibit together and deciding, no, we are not going to do 1 book, we're going to do 3. We could have simplified that a bit. And we're also doing 3 mini symposia. So if you are not tired out after this one, I invite you all on Sunday afternoon to come to hear 3 very well-known art historians who are going to give more of an art historical perspective on the shaft tomb figures from West Mexico. And then in 2 weeks, we will also be having our 3rd and last symposium where we will discuss more of the scientific aspects of what we're doing. And yes, you will hear about the datura in West Mexico, which we think will be very exciting. So, oh, you're looking for which one I am. Pickering, right there. There we go. Okay. One of the things that I truly believe is that all of us as curators in museums, like our colleagues in universities and colleges, have some responsibility, have responsibility to do research. As curators, we may be subject matter specialists of whatever our topics happen to be, and it's certainly possible to be a subject matter specialist by simply reading and following the work of other researchers in the field. But truth be told, the scholarship is better if you're actively doing research yourself and are involved in that. So it's important that curators indeed be active researchers, be interested, be passionate, again referring back to Holly's talk, so that we continue to look at our collections in new ways. That's what makes it exciting. But I also think that in the museum world as curators, we have another responsibility that perhaps our academic colleagues at universities don't have. We have the responsibility of bringing our research, bringing our collections to the public, to share knowledge, and if we're really fortunate, to try to make some kind of connection between these objects of the past and the audiences of today. So that's what we try to do, and technology helps us do that. Well, archaeology is an eclectic and opportunistic discipline, and the slides here that you see represent that. Almost as soon as radiology was invented, it was applied to the study of Egyptian mummies, very early on. As CAT scanning became a good replacement for radiology, there were tests done in Wisconsin at the Milwaukee Public Museum of CAT scanning mummies to see what they look like on the inside. So that the point is, technology is out there, it's available. Archaeology, by its very nature, is a very eclectic discipline, and we are very opportunistic. We are more than happy to use, or at least to try out, techniques that we think may have some application to what we're trying to do. Oh, this is going to be hard to read. Archaeological goals. There are many archaeological goals. Some of them are personal, some of them are sort of discipline-wide. we do try to uncover and recover the past to provide and understand what it means to be human. But as each archaeologist and each researcher develops their own programs, they develop their own archaeological goals. Archaeology today is often and is best done as a team effort. Archaeological sites are unique. Once they're excavated, they're gone. They don't come back. You can't reconstruct them. You can't bring back an extinct animal. You can't bring back an archaeological site once it's excavated. Sites are vast and complex and hold all sorts of data. And so I think it behooves archaeologists that when we decide to put a shovel in the ground, that we know we have very good reasons as to what we're trying to do and that we are collecting as much data as we can possibly collect. That sort of reformation, for lack of a better term, in archaeology happened really twice, back in the 1930s and 40s, in the 1960s and early 70s. Since that time, the drumbeat of using new technologies, of developing more of a team effort to doing archaeological sites, I think has really resulted in some great advances. In order to study the past, we do need many different specialties. Archaeology is a destructive science. Capturing as much data as possible is critical because, as I say, once it's gone, it's gone. One of the things, though, that those of us who are in the museum world find, as Adam said, is we sometimes have great collections that have huge opportunity for research. But what they lack, particularly archaeological collections, is contextual data. The collections were not put together under the best conditions. They were looted, they passed through many hands. But as a curator, you have a challenge. What do you do with these collections? Do you simply say, there's nothing I can do? There's no research opportunity here because we lack contextual data? Or can we start with the objects themselves and see what we can determine from those collections? Oops, let's not go there first. Well, the traditional archaeological questions are distribution in space. If you're interested in a particular culture, if you're interested in the material culture, you look at the pottery, the projectile points, whatever artifacts may be characteristic of that culture, and you look for the geographic distribution, and that gives you some general idea of where those people may have lived. You also want to know about the antiquity of the chronology. What's the time depth of those cultures? How long ago did they live? And you want to know if there are any correlations or connections to other cultures at various times. As we are talking about West Mexico, this is a real problem, and I will say it was a problem even in trying to name the exhibit. West Mexico is indeed part of Mexico, part of ancient Mexico, but it's not a culture that's very well known. We all know the term Aztec, we all know the term Maya, and we may know the term Toltec or Mixtec. West Mexico isn't any of those. It's 1,500 years earlier than the Aztecs. So even deciding what to call that exhibit so that it would sort of engage the contemporary public was kind of difficult. What we tried to do, as you will see in the exhibit, hopefully you've seen the exhibit or will soon, we've tried to make some connections with other cultures to give people a place to start understanding this one. Well, how do we look at things? You know, virtually all of this analysis that we're talking about is a way of looking at the world, a way of looking at objects. Traditionally, using visual examination, maybe a hand lens, we could look at style and form and describe things and measure them and look at surface treatment and maybe repair history, and if we were interested enough, look at wear patterns. We might look at those things, and visually that's very important. That's still the #1 research tool is the human eye. Hand lenses, microscopes, radiography, C14 dating, thermoluminescence dating, all of those are tools that are part of the archaeologist toolkit today and are very useful. But and each technique extends our abilities, but we almost also recognize, and this was a good point that Adam made, each technique has a limitation, and as we're on sort of the cutting edge of research in various areas, part of what we have to do is figure out what are the applications and what are the limitations of any particular research. Well, we live in a time when there are lots of new questions to be asked. The old questions of chronology and geographic distribution, those sorts of things, if not settled, we know a fair amount about them. But as we, as archaeologists, start asking more anthropological and cultural questions, we have to think about new ways to answer them. For example, is there evidence of use? What does useware look like on a 2,000-year-old ceramic figure that's been in the ground? How do you separate intentional useware from the types of changes that simply occur by being buried? There are ways to do that. As you well know with Adam, we're looking at the contents of vessels. You know, for certainly most of my career and all of my archaeological training, we were interested in what the pot looked like. There were very few of my professors who even voiced the question, what was in that pot? Well, clearly that has huge cultural importance, and we want to know that. Well, now, there are techniques available, but as we were talking about in the break, you have to be very careful about how you apply techniques. Every technique that we're using will give you an answer, but that doesn't mean it's a reliable answer. So we have to know what the limits of our techniques are. Can we reconstruct past events and behaviors? Well, when you have an intact archaeological site and it's excavated by archaeologists who know what they're doing, you can do a pretty good job of reconstructing behavior. When you're starting with individual objects, attempting to reconstruct behavior is much more difficult. I will say though, in West Mexico, we have, I think, an advantage that lots of other prehistoric pasts don't have. If you look in the exhibit, you will see these tableaus or models of activity. There's the Mesoamerican ball game, there's a dance group, there are a couple of processions going on, there's a volador ceremony, or at least what's been called a volador ceremony. Those are we'd like to think, snapshots of actual human behavior 2,000 years ago. And they may be, or they may have aspects of daily activity or at least ritual activity. But we need to understand how to analyze them. We need to look at the individual figures there and then compare them to the large individual hollow figures, because what we find is that the personal adornment, the clothing, the tattooing, the body decoration is pretty similar between some of these small, fairly abstract figures on tableaus and the large, more iconic figures themselves. So we have a couple of clues, we have a couple of keys, and certainly in the next couple of years, part of my challenge and part of my interest is going to be trying to make some of those connections in a better way. Well, mining museum collections. Starting in the 1890s, at least in terms of West Mexico, museums started collecting these figures. Carl Lumholtz, Adele Breton, who was a British artist and writer, traveled in northern Mexico, made observations, took photographs. Adele Breton made some extraordinary drawings of West Mexican figures. And those collections eventually ended up in museums. Carl Lumholtz's collection is in the American Museum in New York. The Field Museum in Chicago put together a large collection of West Mexican figures for the 1893 Columbian Exposition. That's a long time ago. So some of these collections have been out of the ground for a long time. If we wanted to talk about handling and residues and contamination, those collections, while very valuable because they were recovered early, also may be the most subject to contamination because they've been in buildings and out of the ground for a very long time. They don't have detailed provenience. So part of our task is to see if we can recontextualize these figures. Well, one of the questions that some of my colleagues and I have been discussing is what's the size of the universe of these West Mexican figures? Now that may sound like an esoteric and silly question. Half of that may be true. It is important to know, are there hundreds of these figures? Are there thousands of these figures? Are there tens of thousands of these figures? We don't know for sure. We do know that virtually every museum in North America that has Mesoamerican archaeological material has material from West Mexico. We know there are large collections in Europe. So we want to know what the size of this body of data is. What we do know is any single museum collection is not representative of the entire universe of these figures. Each museum collection is a result of a specific history. Museum X got a donation in 1930, in 1980, in 1990, and so that's the body of information. The point of that is to try to reconstruct the importance and context of these figures, we need to have a better handle of the entire universe. So one of the things I'm intending to do and have been working on for some time, and that's sort of the subject of the visual guide to West Mexican figures, is to create a database that has as many of these figures in it as we can. Cheryl and I have developed a protocol of about 74 different variables that we look at. And in the visual guide, we sort of have a description and a photograph of each of those variable states. And we have now looked at about 1,500 figures from 5 different museums. Now that the exhibit is up and the books are done, I hope over the next 3 to 5 years, we can get that sample up to at least 5,000. That's a little closer to the universe than one museum collection or even the 1,500 that we have now. So it's going to allow us to start looking at this material in a more systematic way. I will also guarantee you that as we go on, we will be adding new variables. We'll be looking at different things. We'll have to come back and look at old collections that we've seen to look at new variables. And thanks to the work that Adam and others are doing, we may identify some pieces that would be really good to sample. Because we do know, as we look at these figures, many of them have lots of residue in them. Some of it is the type of residue that Adam is interested in that you can't see, but much of it is we see organic residues inside vessels, and sometimes when we're lucky, we see other things, little bugs and snails and all sorts of other things that we may find useful in the future. One of the things that I think is kind of important when you're using museum collections is to really start with the object itself to see what it says, to create what I call an artifact biography. And what I mean by that is it's a forensic approach, meaning starting with the observations, with our archaeological data to provide anthropological interpretations. Each object tells a story, but we have to figure out how to read it, how to understand it. The story, this is an important point. The story that the object tells is understood by the person who made that object and for the people in the culture from which it comes. These figures, for example, this little dance group, we can think of this as a form of visual, what do I want to say? It's a visual language. It's not a word language, it's a visual language. People would understand from this culture what was going on here. We can describe it, we can provide some details, but whether or not we can ever actually interpret in detail this type of thing, we'll find out. It's not going to be easy. So one of the things that we try to do, once we can identify what's going on here, is to then use ethnographic analogy from other parts of Mexico, from the same parts of Mexico. There are still native peoples who live in West Mexico. The question is, of course, these people are now 2,000 years apart from these people, and what kinds of cultural traits, what kinds of cultural activities survive 2,000 years? We know in our own society, there are lots of things that survive 2,000 years. Lots of religious elements, ritual elements. Well, we're looking at ritual, religious elements here. So it shouldn't surprise us if we find some modern examples of these old cultures, but we can't take them for granted just because they're ethnographic elements in this part of the world. That too has to be tested. So we're in the position of trying to decipher coded messages. That's part of what makes it fun. Some of the techniques that we've been using in the last dozen years or so, well, actually now I guess almost 20 years, is endoscopy. You all know what an endoscope is. You probably have had some experience with them in another circumstance. The endoscope actually allows you to sort of double the observational surfaces. You know, we use our eyes to look at the outside of these ceramic vessels, and if they're a figure vessel, you can't really look on the inside with your naked eye, except maybe with a flashlight and a little mirror or something. Well, a medical endoscope is a great tool. It allows us to look at the inside. It lets us look at the repair history, for example, if a piece has been broken and repaired. It allows us to find evidence on the inside, well, authenticity-related evidence on the inside that we look for on the outside. Sometimes we get a prize. We get, as I mentioned earlier, a snail shell, an insect, some evidence of some plant remains. So it can be a very useful tool. Computed axial topography, or tomography. Some of you may have had experience with that as well. One of the great things about that is that the CAT scanning allows us to look at how vessels were constructed and put together. It also gives a very detailed history of any repair or replacement that has been done on an object. So, you know, if I were king of the world, I would have every object at some point get a CAT scan as part of its history. The downside of that is CAT scan uses radioactive material. So if you want to try to do something that is a dating technique on ceramics, that would have to be done before you would do a CAT scan, or you would be very likely to have false results. Archaeoentomology. As many of you know in the audience, I see lots of familiar faces. For a lot of years now, I've been working with an entomological forensic entomologist to examine the insect remains on and inside these vessels. He will be here in 2 weeks to talk about some of the insect remains and his work in forensic entomology. He has also been able to use some of the samples that we've sent to look at the DNA, not only of the insects, but in at least one case, he has found insect parasites on the insects that we found. So he's found the DNA of 2 different kinds of insects in that particular situation. Once we can identify these insects by genus and species, then we have an opportunity to reconstruct something about the environment they came from, and that may help us reconstruct this environment in West Mexico. Electron microscopy. This is something that we have had a chance to use occasionally. It has huge potential for letting us identify the mineral characteristics of pigments and pastes and slips and things. We're also going to be using it to look at the manganese stains. Manganese are black spots that occur on some of these figures. We are now just getting a project off the ground, hopefully, with the chemistry department at TU to start doing more of this work. Here we have 2 kinds of residue, and I'm going to go lightly over this because obviously Adam spent a great deal of time, but the one on the left, you see large sort of clumpy residue here on on the figure with the undulating surface, there are organic residues on there that are not manganese stained. They're organic. They seem to have a more of a splatter pattern, which suggests they were applied after these things were made. Wouldn't it be nice to know if those splatters may have materials related to the rituals in which they were used? So we have questions. We don't have lots of answers yet. Foods and beverages. One of the aspects of West Mexican ceramics is there are large numbers of vessels that have vegetable and fruit forms on them. Again, these have been used in the past by archaeologists simply as typological characteristics. But from my standpoint, the question would be, is it possible that these vessels, and these are storage vessels, ollas, that these storage vessels representing fruits and cactuses in some cases, that they were used to store fermented versions of the plants that are represented on the vessels? Well, intuitively, that seems fairly reasonable, but without data, without the research that can be done, we can't say that. It's an idea, it's an hypothesis to test. So hopefully this will be a direction that we will go in the next few years as well. Well, as some of you may know, and this is in the exhibition, some of these technologies help us look at authenticity. The dog on the left is in the Gilcrease collection. The one on the right was published in the 1890s. They look very similar. Little fat, polished red Colina dogs in West Mexico are pretty common. They're very characteristic of that area. Little fat Colina dogs with human face masks are not. When we first started endoscoping the figures here at the Gilcrease, this was obviously one of the ones that I was most interested in. And we used the endoscope to look inside of the body. And the body inside has the characteristics that we look at and expect to find in genuinely authentic pieces. But when we turned the endoscope around and looked in the head, it told a different story. The material looked much more like plaster. That's not a good sign. So, based on that, we took the dog to the hospital, and Sparky had a CAT scan. And what it demonstrated, because our question was, okay, there's clearly some repair in the head area, but is it repair or is it replacement? Meaning, did that piece originally have a human face mask on it, or is it fantasy that somebody simply added? Well, the endoscope sort of pointed us in the direction, but it didn't answer the question. So by doing the CAT scan, it answered the question. Virtually the entire head is a replacement. This is an extraordinarily, I believe, extraordinarily sophisticated deception from the 1950s. Somebody did some pretty good work. What does that mean for those of us in the museum business? Well, it means the same thing that it means in forensic work. You need to ask the first question first. Are the things you're working with authentic? In the archaeological context, as many of us can attest, the answer to that question has a broad range. It's not a simple yes and no, a simple authentic versus not authentic. There are lots of variations in between. But this was a really good case. It didn't give us the information we wanted, but it gave us the information we needed. So as I said, every piece tells a story, and sometimes it's not the one you want. What you're looking at here are a couple of the CT images, and you can see that the material in the head is very different in many ways from the material in the body of that figure. So finally, you know, what is the relationship between science and exhibits? Well, working on collections is important. We have collections. Every museum has collections. What's the value of those collections? Is it simply to put those collections on display? Is it simply the aesthetics of the piece? Or are there research opportunities there? I believe there are great research opportunities, and I believe that by asking new questions, using new techniques, you bring old collections alive once again every generation. You're always making those things new. There are lots of examples of that in the museum world. Certainly in the archaeological context, it's an important thing to do. Every new technique that we use, every new study that we do, also provides us new insights and may allow us to change or to modify interpretations of these people that we are trying to study. The science, I think, also enriches an exhibition. It shows that not all the good stuff's been done yet. We don't know everything we need to know. So for, let's say, kids who come into an exhibit, hopefully part of the message is, here's a question we don't have an answer to today. Maybe you'll answer it in the future. I think that's an important museum message to put out there. And that daily, new discoveries are made. We're always learning new things. And so our challenge is to do the work that we normally do in the museum, to create exhibits and programs and all those sorts of things, but also to make sure that there's a robust research program that really validates the importance of our collections and helps us make every collection new for every generation. Thank you.